Hello, my name is Mirko Peters, and I translate how technology actually shapes business reality. Right now, I see a lot of leaders making the same fundamental mistake with AI because they think the answer is tighter control. They are adding more approvals, more review layers, and more oversight from the top, but in most organizations, that doesn't actually create safety, it creates drag. AI changes the basic economics of knowledge by shifting how fast information moves, how quickly options appear, and where judgment can actually happen. If your leadership still runs on old control logic, the leader quickly becomes the bottleneck, which isn't a style issue or a question of leading softly versus strongly. It's a system outcome. This structural friction affects your decision speed, your AI ROI, and how resilient your organization stays when the pressure is on. If you want more executive-level clarity on Microsoft 365, Copilot, Azure, and AI leadership, subscribe to the podcast. To understand why this is happening, let me take one step back and explain why control worked for such a long time. Why control worked before AI? Control worked because the traditional organization was built entirely around scarcity. Information was hard to find, context was even rarer, and the ability to make sense of data at scale was the most expensive resource of all. If you look at how most companies were designed, leadership authority was tied very closely to access because the people at the top usually had the broadest view. They saw more of the business, they had access to more reports, and they held the cross-functional context that everyone else lacked. Because information moved so slowly back then, concentrating power at the top actually made a lot of sense. Whether you were running an industrial company or a large services business 20 years ago, you couldn't just assume everyone had the same visibility. Reports took time to generate, analysis took weeks to finish, and coordination required constant meetings. So escalation existed because someone had to compress that complexity and absorb the risk. This is the part most people miss. Hierarchy was never just about power. It was an information processing design where a manager functioned as a routing layer. They acted as a review and translation layer, taking signals from one part of the business and interpreting them so the next layer could actually use the data. The organization itself had massive limits. Human limits, communication limits, and tooling limits all dictated how we worked. The old tech stack was slow. Data lived in disconnected systems, and critical knowledge sat trapped in people's heads, inboxes, and messy spreadsheets. If you wanted to make a decision with real impact, you usually had to move through the specific people who had enough context to reduce the chance of an expensive mistake. In that environment, control was a valid response to uncertainty. It reduced variance, kept unmanaged risk low, and made the final output much more predictable. That mattered a lot in worlds where the cost of an error was high and the pace of change was much lower than what we deal with today. This is exactly why review culture and long approval chains became the standard way of doing business. Escalation became normal, not because leaders were bad or because managers loved bureaucracy for its own sake, but because the system rewarded those specific behaviors. When information is fragmented and coordination is expensive, gatekeeping can actually improve performance by trading speed for consistency. For a long time, consistency was the winning move. Now map that same logic to middle management. A lot of that work was never purely about supervision. It was about compression and taking many moving parts to turn them into something the next level could act on. Status reporting, coordination, and risk signaling all made the machine run smoothly. In that world, control wasn't a personality trait, it was an operating principle. The leader reviewed work because the system lacked any other way to create confidence, and the manager checked every detail because visibility was always incomplete. The executive had to insert themselves because the quality of a downstream decision depended entirely on the concentration of context at the top. When people talk about traditional leadership as if it was just ego or a bad command and control habit, I think they are missing the point. A lot of that behavior was structurally rational because it fit the environment, the constraints, and the business reality of slower organizations with limited information flow. If we don't understand why control worked, we will misdiagnose exactly what is failing right now. We'll end up blaming leaders for habits that were once highly adaptive, or we'll call it resistance when it's really just architectural lag. The problem isn't just a mindset issue, it's that the old design assumptions are finally collapsing. If leadership authority was built on controlling scarce information, what happens when that information is no longer scarce? Everything changes when summarization, analysis, and pattern detection become cheap and accessible to everyone. When people much closer to the actual work can access the same insights that used to sit only at the top, the old model breaks. Once that break begins, control stops being protective and starts becoming pure latency. It turns into dependency and structural drag, which is exactly why AI fundamentally changes the leadership equation. What AI actually changes in leadership reality? AI changes leadership because it fundamentally drops the cost of thinking work. That is the real shift. Most people still talk about AI as if it's just another productivity tool to help us write faster, summarize documents, or search for data. While it certainly does those things, looking at it that way is far too small for anyone in a leadership role because the technology is doing something much more structural. The more important change is that AI lowers the cost of analysis, interpretation, and generating options across the entire organization. It doesn't just automate tasks, it amplifies decisions. And why does that matter? Traditional leadership held a hidden advantage for a long time because the people at the top usually knew more and could process more than the people below them. This wasn't always because they were smarter, but because the organizational structure gave them privileged access to information and synthesis that others simply couldn't reach. AI starts eroding that structural advantage very quickly. Now, a team lead can summarize a complex body of information in minutes, and a project manager can compare strategic options faster than ever before. A frontline expert can use AI to spot patterns or draft a business case without waiting for 3 layers of management to weigh in, which means the old logic where important judgment sits at the top is breaking down. It isn't disappearing completely, but it is breaking structurally. If you look closely, this is exactly where many leadership teams get confused. They assume AI is a tool the workforce uses while the role of leadership remains basically the same as it was 10 years ago. But here's the thing, if AI changes who can generate insight, it also changes where decisions can happen responsibly. Leadership is no longer defined by being the main processor of information for the group. Instead, leadership becomes the designer of the conditions under which good decisions happen, and that is a very different job. I want to be careful here. This does not mean hierarchy disappears overnight, nor does it mean every decision should be decentralized to the edges. Most importantly, it definitely does not mean AI replaces human judgment, as the research simply doesn't support that conclusion. What the data does support is something much more precise. Organizations are adopting AI widely, but most are not getting any real value from it because their operating model stays exactly the same. In fact, 95% of organizations report zero ROI from generative AI investments, primarily because the human operating model never changed to match the technology. That is the entire point. The model is not failing because the AI is weak. The model is failing because the leadership structure is misaligned with what the technology now makes possible. If AI gives more people access to context and recommendations, but the organization still routes every judgment through a narrow approval chain, then nothing fundamental improves. You just generate more output that waits longer in a queue, creating more analysis and more documents that eventually hit the same old decision path. When the decision path stays old, AI does not create leverage, it creates a backlog. This is why so many organizations mistake adoption for true transformation. They deploy, co-pilot, roll out assistants, and celebrate high usage numbers, but if the authority model is unchanged, the system stays slow. The work looks more modern, but the flow does not. The people inside the system may even become more frustrated because they can see better options earlier, yet they still lack the authority to act on them. The friction becomes more visible. Once AI reduces the cost of generating insight, delay is no longer caused by a lack of information. Delay moves to coordination, trust, and unclear authority, often caused by leaders who still feel they need to touch every single piece of work. That is the real leadership shift. The bottleneck is moving. It used to sit in information scarcity, but now it sits in decision design. This is where many strong leaders accidentally become a drag on the organization. It isn't because they lack vision or reject AI, but because they still operate as if the safest model is to personally absorb more judgment than one person can scale. From a system perspective, that is not just unrealistic, it is fragile. It turns leadership into a single point of failure. Once you see that, the next break in the old model becomes obvious. Control stops scaling. Break 1, control stops scaling. Here's the first real break in the old model. Control stops scaling because every extra approval creates a queue, and those queues are never neutral. They change behavior. The moment a team learns that the safest path is to wait for a leadership review, you don't just slow one decision down. You train the whole system to escalate every issue, which causes initiative to drop and local judgment to weaken over time. That is the part many leaders miss. They think they are protecting quality, but what they are actually doing is concentrating motion. Everything starts flowing toward one person or one meeting, and while that can feel responsible or look like strong leadership, it structurally creates a narrowing funnel. Once AI enters that funnel, the pressure gets much worse because the organization can now generate more analysis and more recommendations than ever before. The volume rises and the possible speed rises. If the approval structure stays fixed, all that additional capability just arrives faster at the same bottleneck. The leader feels overwhelmed, the team feels blocked, and the business feels like AI somehow failed to deliver on its promise. It didn't fail. The system around it did exactly what it was designed to do. It routed too much judgment into too few places. Now map that to day-to-day work. A team uses AI to prepare a proposal, comparing scenarios and summarizing customer signals faster than they ever could manually. But then they still wait for the same director or the same steering group to review the wording and validate the logic before anything moves. The technical output gets faster, but the operational flow does not. This is where control turns from oversight into latency. Latency has second-order effects that go beyond just slowing down delivery. It changes what people choose to do, because if a team knows every decision will be reopened at the top, they start optimizing for approval instead of outcomes. They write safer documents and avoid edge cases. They stop developing the muscle of making well-bounded decisions themselves. And over time, that becomes learned helplessness. This isn't because your people are weak, but because the environment trained them that independent judgment has low payoff and high risk. That is a system outcome. This is why highly capable leaders can accidentally create weak organizations. The stronger and smarter the leader is, the easier it becomes for everyone else to defer to them. If that leader has great judgment and high standards, the team often becomes even more dependent because they assume the best answer will eventually come from above anyway. The organization starts borrowing competence from one person instead of building it across the system. That works for a while, but it does not scale. It creates concentration risk and a single point of failure. Under AI conditions, the cost of that failure rises because the rest of the organization now has more capacity than the control structure can possibly absorb. This is also why control-heavy environments often underuse AI without even realizing it. Technically, the tools are deployed and available, but behavior stays cautious. People use AI for drafts and notes rather than judgment or workflow leverage. Because if authority is still centralized, AI becomes optional advice instead of operational infrastructure. It can suggest and it can summarize, but it cannot change outcomes unless the surrounding decision path changes too. That is the game changer nobody talks about enough. AI does not remove bottlenecks by itself, it exposes them. Once exposed, those bottlenecks are often leadership shaped. Again, this is not a character flaw or a reason to blame leaders for being too involved. In many cases, these are the exact behaviors that help the business succeed under earlier, slower conditions. But the same behavior that once protected quality can now suppress scale. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. When decision quality depends on one leader touching too many things, the organization is not well controlled. It is fragile. Once AI increases the pace and volume of possible decisions, that fragility becomes impossible to hide. To make this concrete, let me show you what that looks like inside a real operating pattern, because this next case is where the bottleneck becomes visible. It's an anchor case, the leader who became the bottleneck. I want to show you what this looks like in a very common pattern, and I want to be clear that this isn't a story about failure. This is a story about high-level competence that simply stopped scaling because the environment changed. I was recently working with an organization running a serious AI initiative where they had good people, a smart team, and strong leadership sponsorship. One senior leader in particular was deeply committed to getting it right. And because he was experienced, trusted, and held high standards, he was exactly the kind of person most organizations want near a high-risk transformation. At first, his involvement looked like a massive advantage for the project. This leader reviewed every output, scrutinized the recommendations, and even checked the specific prompts the team was using. He checked the reasoning, he checked the framing, and he constantly verified whether the team was asking the model the right questions in the first place. Nothing moved without that final layer of executive validation, which looked responsible from the outside. If you watched their meetings, you would probably say this person was doing a great job protecting quality and making sure weak logic didn't leak into the business while the organization was still learning. In the short term, that was actually true. The outputs were cleaner, the team was more careful, and the language became more precise because everyone knew their work would be examined under a microscope. But here is what happened underneath the surface. The team adapted to the structure rather than the strategy, and that is the part that actually matters for long-term performance. Very quickly, people stopped making decisions and started preparing for reviews, which shifted their focus entirely. They didn't ask what the best next move was within their boundary, but instead they asked what would survive the leader's inspection. That changed the nature of the work. Instead of using AI to improve the flow of decisions, they used it to improve the quality of their submissions. Instead of building local judgment, they built better escalation packets, and instead of acting faster, they documented more carefully and waited. And why is that? It happened because the real system signal wasn't to use AI well and move, but rather to use AI carefully and then bring it upward. Initiatives started dropping in small, almost invisible ways as people delayed recommendations until they were perfectly polished. They avoided ambiguous but valuable ideas because those created more review friction, and they ended up using AI more conservatively than they could have. The strongest people on the team became the most cautious because they understood best how much rework and executive override would create. This clicked for me when I saw the waiting patterns, and you could actually feel the queue in the room. There were drafts waiting for comments, options waiting for judgment, and meetings waiting for availability. Workstreams were waiting for one person to confirm what was already directionally clear, but nobody called it a bottleneck. They called it alignment, they called it quality control, and they called it executive oversight. But structurally, it was a queue, and queues tell you where the real operating model lives. Now map that to the pressure AI creates. The team could produce more than ever before, including more summaries, more comparisons, and more scenario drafts. They were generating more structured outputs in less time, but the final decision capacity of the system had not changed at all. It was still concentrated in one person, so the more capable the AI-supported team became, the more pressure built around that one review point. That is the paradox of the situation. The organization looked more advanced on paper, but it behaved less fluidly in reality. The emotional cost was easy to miss because the leader became overloaded while the team became hesitant. Because nobody wanted to say the leader was the issue, the friction was explained away as complexity or a maturity gap. But if you look closely, behavior was being driven by dependency, and it created a single point of failure. The leader did not fail, and that is an important distinction to make. He was doing exactly what the old model rewarded by staying close, protecting quality, and absorbing uncertainty personally. The system was doing exactly what it was designed to do, but it just wasn't designed for what the organization now needs. Under AI conditions, throughput and learning matter just as much as accuracy. If one person validates too much, the organization does not build decision strength. It simply rents judgment from the top. That rental model gets expensive fast because you lose speed, you lose confidence, and you lose local ownership. Eventually, you lose a big part of the value AI could have created in the first place. When people ask why AI adoption feels shallow in otherwise capable organizations, this is often the answer. The tools arrived, but the leadership model didn't change, and once you see that, the alternative becomes much clearer. The opposite of this isn't leader absence, it's architectural leadership. It's a leader who builds boundaries instead of cues. A contrast case, the system designer leader. Now compare that with a very different kind of leader who faced the same pressure and the same AI opportunity. The need for quality was identical, but the design of the leadership approach was entirely different. Instead of touching every important action, this leader defined the system around the action. That sounds like a subtle shift, but it isn't, and it changes everything about how the team functions. I saw this in another environment where the leader made an early decision that they would not become the approval layer for every AI-supported workflow. This wasn't because they cared less about the outcome, but because they understood that if the organization needed their personal intervention every time, the initiative would never scale. So they started somewhere else. Instead of adding more review, they focused on clearer boundaries. They defined what kinds of decisions could be made locally, what kinds needed consultation, and what kinds required escalation. Just as important, they defined where AI could assist without pretending the AI was the owner of the task. That distinction mattered a lot because the team no longer had to guess where the line was. They knew which decisions were theirs, they knew which data they were expected to use, and they knew which risks triggered a human checkpoint. They knew when the leader wanted to see the issue, not because everything was routed upward by habit, but because specific thresholds had been crossed. That creates a very different operating environment where people stop preparing everything for executive inspection and start making decisions inside a designed frame. And why is that so powerful? It's powerful because confidence comes from clarity rather than managerial presence. High-performing organizations are not winning because they have more AI capability in the abstract, but because they redesign workflows with explicit validation and ownership logic. In other words, they build trust into the structure. In this second case, the leader spent less time reviewing outputs line by line and more time doing architectural work. They focused on clarifying intent, naming constraints, and making trade-offs visible. They spent their energy checking whether the people expected to decide actually had the data, access, and authority to do it. That last part is where many organizations still fail because they say a team owns an outcome, but the team doesn't have the permissions or the process visibility to actually execute. From a system perspective, that's not empowerment, it's structural misalignment. This leader understood that, so instead of telling people to be more proactive, they removed the contradictions. If a manager was accountable for a decision, they got the inputs needed to make it. If AI was expected to support a workflow, the team got clarity on what good looked like. If escalation was necessary, it had a defined purpose rather than a vague upward movement just to be safe. The result was visible very quickly as decision speed improved because people stopped waiting for permission in situations where permission was no longer required. AI usage also changed because the tools were no longer treated as optional helpers used for drafting before the real decision happened somewhere else. They became part of the workflow and a source of structured input. They were used to test options and reduce friction in repeatable judgment, but always inside clear ownership. That is the key to the whole thing. AI got stronger because accountability stayed visible, and the leader's role became more valuable, not less. They were less of a controller and more of a designer. They stopped being a central processor and became a builder of the environment in which good processing happens. This is where the leadership shift becomes real for me. The leader is not competing with AI, but is designing the conditions under which humans and AI can make better decisions together. That means defining boundaries before speed creates chaos, and aligning ownership before insight creates a backlog. It means making sure responsibility and access point in the same direction. When that happens, local judgment gets stronger, dependency goes down, and throughput goes up. The system becomes calmer, which is important because good design does not just make organizations faster, it makes them less emotionally expensive to operate. People know where they stand, they know when to act, and they know when to ask. They do not have to perform uncertainty upward just to stay safe. The real contrast here is simple. One leader protects quality by becoming the path, while the other protects quality by designing the path. One centralizes judgment while the other distributes it inside guardrails. One creates dependency and the other creates structural resilience. Once you see that difference, the next shift becomes obvious. If control no longer scales, leadership has to move into context. Shift 1. From control to context. If leadership is no longer about touching every single decision, we have to ask what actually replaces that function. The answer is context. I don't mean loose inspiration or those broad vision statements that live on a wall and die in practice. And I'm certainly not talking about a slide with 5 priorities that nobody knows how to apply on a Tuesday afternoon when things get messy. I mean usable context, which is the kind of structural clarity that helps your people make better choices without waiting for you to walk into the room. This specific executive function starts to matter most in the AI era because once information, analysis, and recommendations become easy to generate, raw insight is no longer the scarce resource. The scarce resource is shared orientation. We have to be able to answer the fundamental questions of the system. What are we optimizing for right now? What trade-offs are we actually willing to accept? What level of risk are we comfortable carrying? When priorities collide, what matters more? Speed, margin, customer trust, compliance, or learning? If you don't make those boundaries clear, your people and your AI tools will still produce output, and they'll produce a lot of it. But the quality will be inconsistent because the direction layer is weak, which is why context scales so much better than commands. A command is a single point of success that solves one moment, but context improves 1,000 moments. A command tells someone what to do once, while context helps them decide what to do repeatedly across situations you haven't personally reviewed yet. This is vital because AI expands the number of moments where a decision could happen, and it gives your teams more possible actions and more ways to interpret the data. If leadership responds by issuing more detailed instructions, the system quickly becomes unmanageable since you simply cannot centrally script every judgment call in a fast-moving human AI environment. But you can define the frame. You can set the intent, state the constraints, and name the non-negotiables. When you explain the trade-offs that matter, you give local decisions coherence without forcing central control. Now, people often mistake context for soft language, but from a business perspective, context is concrete infrastructure. It includes your risk tolerance in a specific workflow and what a successful customer outcome looks like. It defines which compliance boundaries must never be crossed and what level of confidence is enough to move forward. You have to decide where human review is required and what should be optimized locally versus what must stay globally aligned. That isn't vague, that is decision infrastructure. This is where many leaders still create hidden confusion. They believe they've provided context because they stated a goal, like growing faster or using AI responsibly, but goals without trade-off logic don't help people decide anything under pressure. If your team hears 2 priorities at once, and you haven't told them which one wins when they conflict, you haven't given them context. You've just given them ambition, and ambition does not scale decisions. I saw this clearly years ago in technology programs where leaders kept asking for ownership, but that ownership was sitting in a vacuum. The teams knew the target, but they didn't know the boundary conditions. So every difficult moment still became an escalation. Now map that same logic to Microsoft 365 and Copilot. A lot of organizations think Copilot value starts with the licenses, but it actually starts with the context sitting behind the workflow. If your permissions are messy and your information is fragmented, AI will still generate output, but that output enters an environment with weak orientation. People hesitate, validation cycles expand, and trust eventually drops. The issue here is not just prompt quality, it is context quality. Can the system tell your people and your tools what good actually means in this house? Can it make the intended path visible? Can it show where confidence is high and where a human needs to step in? That is the work of leadership now. It's not about owning every answer, but owning the frame where better answers can emerge. When you do that, the system behavior changes. Teams stop asking for permission because they can finally see the logic. They act inside a known structure and use AI as part of their judgment rather than a risky experiment. That is the shift from interruption to orientation. Once that context is clear, we have to look at how decisions actually move through the system. Shift 2. From decisions to decision systems. Once the context is set, your next job is to design how decisions move. Most organizations still think about this far too personally. They ask who the decision maker is, and while that matters, it's too small of a question for an AI-enabled company. The better question is, what is the decision system? If you only name a person but fail to define the inputs, thresholds, and escalation paths, you haven't built a scalable model. You've just named a person, and a person is not a functioning system. This distinction is critical because AI increases decision volume by surfacing more anomalies and recommendations earlier than ever before. If leadership still acts like good execution means sending every one of those moments upward, the organization stays stuck in heroic mode. The leader becomes the interpreter and the fallback for everything, which might feel strong, but structurally, it's a single point of failure. It depends on exceptional humans instead of repeatable pathways. A real decision system has to answer a few practical questions. Who decides and what inputs do they use? At what confidence level do we move and what specific constraints are in place? What triggers an escalation and who validates the result after the fact? Most importantly, who corrects the system when the patterns start producing bad outcomes? That is the architecture. Without it, people confuse intelligence with readiness. They think because a dashboard looks good or a Copilot summary sounds smart, the organization is ready to move. But information availability is not the same thing as decision readiness. A team can see everything and still not know who has the right to act. A manager can receive a strong recommendation and still wait because the consequences of acting are unclear. You can have a workflow that is rich in signals but completely poor in movement. Decision quality doesn't scale by itself, but decision design does. This is where leadership moves away from the heroic image we've been taught to reward. The heroic leader makes the hard call in the room, but the architectural leader makes it clear how hard calls are made by the right people without needing intervention. It's less dramatic, but it's far more valuable for the business. You might wonder if this reduces your authority, but it actually just changes the form of that authority. Your power stops living in personal intervention and starts living in the rules and pathways that shape execution. That is more durable and much more resilient under pressure. If every meaningful judgment has to route through one executive, you don't have a decision system, you have a dependency structure. And dependency structures always break when speed increases. This is why I believe many organizations overinvest in reporting while they underinvest in decision architecture. They produce beautiful weekly scorecards and AI-generated summaries, but they leave the core questions unresolved. They don't know who owns the call or what data is enough to move. They haven't decided what can be automated and what must stay human. If those things are fuzzy, all the intelligence in the world just creates more waiting. And waiting has a massive cost, not just in speed, but in confidence and trust. People stop believing the system will support them, so they either escalate everything or start routing around the official process. That's exactly how shadow systems are born. The spreadsheets and private chats aren't there because people are rebellious. They exist because the formal decision path is too vague or too slow to carry the load. If you want a practical way to think about this, stop asking if your leaders are making good decisions. Start asking if your organization has good decision pathways. One of those scales and the other doesn't. Once you look at leadership through this lens, you see that visibility alone doesn't solve friction, which brings us to the next failure point: dashboards. Why dashboards don't fix decision friction? I've noticed a recurring pattern where organizations confuse the act of seeing with the act of moving. They spend months building complex dashboards and unifying their reporting, and they hope that surfacing more metrics from more data sources will finally solve their problems. Then these same leaders wonder why the organization still feels slow, even though everyone now has a front row seat to the data. But here's the thing: a dashboard increases visibility, but it does not automatically increase decision readiness. And those are not the same thing. You can make the whole organization more informed and still leave it structurally hesitant, which is exactly what happens when teams see a problem but lack the clear authority to fix it. That is the failure point. Leaders often assume friction exists because information is missing, so they solve for reporting by adding more real-time AI dashboards. If the real issue is that nobody knows who can act or what kind of action is allowed without escalation, then better visibility just makes the stall more obvious. It doesn't remove the friction, it actually makes the frustration worse. Because now everyone can see the same issue and still nobody moves, it creates a very specific kind of organizational fatigue. People stop trusting the operating model because they realize that if the signal is visible and nothing happens, the blockage is somewhere above them. This is why I'm skeptical when leaders say they need more transparency as the answer to AI-era coordination problems. Transparency matters, of course, but transparency without decision design becomes observational theater, where the organization gets better at watching itself instead of getting better at acting. Now map that to enterprise reality. A team has a dashboard showing adoption trends and workflow delays, while an AI assistant summarizes the patterns and suggests likely causes. That sounds mature, but if no one owns the call or the response path is ambiguous, the insight just sits there, visible and accurate but completely unused. Dashboards often become a substitute for leadership design because they give the feeling of control through oversight. Leaders can review the numbers and ask questions in meetings to feel informed, but the people inside the system still don't know whether they are allowed to act on what they see. So the organization keeps escalating interpretation instead of distributing action. This is where AI can accidentally amplify the problem because it makes it easier to summarize what's happening and produce recommendations. The reporting layer becomes even stronger, but if ownership is still weak, AI just helps you generate higher quality, unresolved insight. That's not transformation, it's just faster observation. And observation is not the same thing as execution. Visibility is upstream of action, but it does not guarantee action because decision systems need role clarity and intervention rights to function. Without that, teams may look data-rich while behaving decision-poor. This clicked for me in environments where reporting maturity was actually very high and the dashboards were clean. Everyone in the room could see the issue, but the conversation drifted immediately toward who needed to align first and whether acting now would create political risk. The issue was never visibility, it was ownership under uncertainty. So if you want a simple test, here it is. When a dashboard shows a clear problem, can the people closest to that problem act within a defined boundary without waiting for hierarchy to metabolize the information first? If the answer is no, then the dashboard is not fixing friction, it is documenting friction. And once you see that clearly, the next question becomes unavoidable. If authority can no longer sit only in hierarchy, then what actually holds the organization together? That's where alignment starts to matter more than title. Shift 3, from authority to alignment. So if dashboards don't solve decision friction and authority alone no longer keeps execution coherent, what does? The answer is alignment. And I mean alignment in the hard sense, not just nodding in a steering committee or repeating the same strategy language. I'm talking about structural alignment where data, access, incentives, and accountability actually point in the same direction. In older organizations, hierarchy created alignment by force because the title carried the signal and the chain of command held the pieces together. It wasn't elegant, but it worked because information moved slowly and authority was concentrated. But once AI increases the speed and spread of insight, title stops being enough. You can have a very senior sponsor and still have a badly aligned system because execution does not happen where the org chart looks clean. It happens where responsibility, information, and action rights meet. If those three things are separated, the system stalls. If a team is responsible for improving customer response quality, but the relevant data and workflow permissions sit somewhere else, then that team does not really own the outcome. They carry the accountability, but not the power. And from a system perspective, that is fragile. It's a single point of failure. On the other hand, if access is distributed widely, but nobody is clearly accountable for the effect of the decisions made, the opposite problem appears. The system drifts because people can act, but nobody owns the trade-offs or the consequence when local optimization creates enterprise damage. Alignment is the work of matching responsibility, authority, and access so they line up perfectly. This is where leadership becomes much more architectural than positional because the job is no longer mainly to say yes or no from above. The job is to make sure the people expected to move the business can actually move it without breaking the business. That means asking a very different set of questions. Who is accountable for this outcome? Do they have the data and permission they need? Do they know when they can act alone and when they must escalate if they make a bad call? Is there a visible correction path? That is alignment, and the reason it matters more than authority now is simple. AI expands capability faster than most organizations expand coherence, which creates a dangerous gap. The tools and recommendations get stronger, but if the surrounding structure is misaligned, those gains don't turn into better decisions. They turn into more friction and more arguments about who is allowed to do what. This is also why so many AI initiatives feel politically messy, not because the technology is inherently chaotic, but because AI exposes every place where power and responsibility were already misaligned. It shows you where people are blamed without being equipped and where approvals still sit with roles that no longer add value. It shows you where the official owner is not the operational owner, and once that becomes visible, leadership has a choice: defend the old shape or redesign the alignment layer. That might mean moving decision rights closer to the work or changing incentives so teams stop escalating for safety and start deciding within their guardrails. It might mean clarifying who can stop action and who owns remediation after the fact, but the principle stays the same. It's not title that creates coordinated execution, it's aligned design. And once authority shifts into alignment, oversight has to evolve too. Because if leaders keep measuring presence and approvals, they'll miss the actual health of the system. If you audited your structural resilience the same way you audit your systems, what would you find? And more importantly, is that system designed to sustain you or slowly drain you over time? Shift 4. From oversight to system feedback. Once authority moves into alignment, the way we handle oversight has to change along with it, because the old model was built entirely for visible labor. In that world, you watched activity, tracked manual approvals, and checked whether people stayed responsive inside the chain of command. That approach made sense when a manager's primary job was to monitor execution closely, mainly because execution was difficult to see any other way. But in an organization powered by AI, that traditional model starts breaking down fast, and the reason is that busyness is no longer a reliable proxy for actual contribution. Approval volume is no longer a reliable proxy for real control, and managerial presence is definitely not a reliable proxy for system health. You can have leaders and meetings everywhere while the organization still performs poorly, and in many cases, a high density of oversight is actually a signal that the underlying design is weak. So here is the shift. Leaders have to stop treating oversight as a personal inspection and start treating it as feedback design. You are no longer asking if you personally reviewed enough work, but instead you are asking what the system is telling you about how work is really flowing. You want to know where the process stalls, where trust drops, and where people are constantly overriding or ignoring the AI. When you see rework, clustering, or escalations piling up around the same few roles, that is the system giving you feedback. A distributed human AI system does not stay healthy because leaders remain highly involved in every single moment, but it stays healthy because the system produces signals early enough for leaders to adjust the design before a small failure compounds into a disaster. This requires a completely different leadership posture that is less about being a watchdog and more about building a sensor architecture. Instead of checking effort, you are reading patterns, which is exactly how mature technical systems already work today. We don't keep infrastructure stable by standing next to every server and hoping a person notices a problem. We build observability and track anomalies to find failure patterns. Now, map that logic to leadership. If decisions are slowing down, don't just ask who is underperforming, but ask where the flow is getting trapped in the pipes. If teams keep escalating things they should own, don't just tell them to be bolder. Ask what in the system taught them that escalation is safer than taking action. This is where it becomes relevant for anyone responsible for systems, because feedback is how you prevent hidden fragility. Without it, you won't see the single points of failure until they finally break, and you won't notice when one leader is approving everything or when a team is stuck waiting on permissions. One day, the organization will demand more speed and ROI, but you'll realize the system has been quietly draining all three for months. I keep coming back to structural resilience because feedback lets you correct the course before pressure becomes permanent damage. It shows you whether your operating model is actually learning or just repeating the same mistakes. It tells you if your AI rollout is changing how decisions are made, or if it's just adding another layer of noise on top of an unchanged hierarchy. There is another reason this matters. Feedback reduces blame. When leaders only inspect people, every problem looks like a personal failing, leading them to believe a manager is weak or a team lacks urgency. But when you inspect patterns, you see that many recurring people problems are actually design problems wearing a human face. It's a system outcome, and once you see it that way, your intervention quality improves significantly. You stop pushing for motivation where the real issue is ambiguity, and you stop adding governance where the issue is actually a lack of ownership. Oversight in the AI era isn't disappearing. It's just getting sharper and focusing on the health of the decision environment. The real leadership questions now are whether the system can move without constant executive rescue, and whether AI contributes in ways that actually change outcomes. Once you accept that your job is to manage the system rather than the people, the next step becomes very practical. You have to decide what to measure to ensure the system is healthy rather than just appearing to be under control. What leaders should measure instead? If you want to know whether your system can actually scale, you have to change what you are tracking. Start with decision latency, which isn't about how long a meeting lasted or how fast someone replied on Slack, but the full time from detecting an issue to taking meaningful action. When a problem becomes visible, the clock starts, and how long it takes to resolve tells you more than any activity metric ever could. If latency stays high even after AI improves your analysis, then the problem isn't a lack of intelligence, it's a broken pathway or a clogged queue. The second metric to watch is the dependency rate, which tracks how often work pauses because one specific person or approval path is required before anyone can move forward. Dependency is where fragility hides, and a system with high dependency looks coordinated until the pressure rises and you realize too much motion is concentrated in too few places. This is a single point of failure, and measuring it allows you to see concentration without turning it into a personal judgment against a manager. You aren't accusing a leader of being a control freak, you're simply measuring whether the operating model can function without them. The third metric is ownership clarity, which asks if people actually know who decides, who inputs, and who owns the correction when things go wrong. This needs to be true in real workflows under pressure on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, not just in a theoretical handbook. If ownership is fuzzy, decision quality will be inconsistent no matter how much AI support you add, because people hesitate when the authority path is unclear. Then there is the matter of AI adoption in the actual workflow. We aren't talking about license activation or how many prompts were written last month, but whether the AI actually changed how the work moves. Did it reduce the cycle time, improve the quality of the first pass, or help the decision happen closer to the front lines? If AI usage sits outside the primary workflow, you don't have a transformation, you just have assisted busyness. Leaders should also watch the override pattern to see how often AI recommendations are ignored or reversed by humans. A near zero override rate might mean trust is high, or it might mean nobody is actually reviewing the work carefully. Conversely, a high override rate could mean the model is weak or the team doesn't understand where the AI should be trusted. You should also measure rework, specifically decision-linked rework, where a choice is reopened because boundaries or owners were unclear. Rework is a clear sign that the system is wasting energy to compensate for poor design, yet many organizations still mistake this for being thorough. Often, it is just structural compensation for a system that didn't get it right the first time. Pay close attention to decision consistency as well. When similar situations appear in different teams, do they produce similar choices within the same guardrails, or does the answer depend on who was in the room? Consistency tells you if your context and decision design are strong enough to travel across the entire organization without constant handholding. Finally, you must track trust signals to see if people feel safe acting within their assigned boundaries. You need to know if they believe the system will support a good local decision or if they expect to be punished later through political correction. Low trust creates delay creates escalation, and escalation creates the kind of concentration that leads to systemic fragility. When you put all of this together, you get a much clearer picture of leadership effectiveness in the AI era. It's not about how visible a leader is or how many approvals they signed off on, but whether the organization can convert insight into action without needing executive heroics. We are moving from activity to flow, from presence to resilience, and from managerial touch to true system health. Once you start measuring this way, you'll find it impossible to ignore whether responsibility and access are actually aligned. Power alignment, matching access with responsibility. This is where leadership design becomes very concrete. A system becomes fragile the moment we make someone responsible for an outcome without giving them the access, permissions, or intervention rights required to influence it. That sounds obvious, but it is one of the most common design flaws in enterprise environments today. We ask managers to improve adoption while the data sits in a different silo, and we ask teams to own service quality even though every workflow change requires another department's approval. We ask business units to use AI responsibly, but they often don't know which data is trusted, which automations are allowed, or who has the authority to pause a process when things start drifting. The result is that responsibility moves down while power stays at the top. When that happens, the organization starts performing alignment instead of actually living it. People attend the meetings and repeat the priorities while producing the reports, but underneath it all, the system is still waiting for power to travel from the center. That is not empowerment, it is just delay with better language. And why does this matter even more in the Microsoft ecosystem? Tools like Copilot, Power Platform, and automation don't just support work. They actually amplify whatever structure already exists. If your governance is vague, automation scales that vagueness across the company. If your permissions are inconsistent, Copilot scales that inconsistent context for every user. If your approval paths are concentrated in one office, Power Platform can make teams build faster right up to the point where they hit the same old bottleneck. The technology does not fix power misalignment, it exposes it, and sometimes it does so quite brutally. This is why I think leaders need to get much sharper about 4 specific kinds of rights. First are decision rights, which define who can actually make the call. Second are data rights, which determine who can access the information required to decide well. Third are escalation rights, which clarify who can trigger a higher review and under what specific conditions. Finally, there are intervention rights, which dictate who can stop, correct, or reroute a workflow when reality changes. If those rights are split across too many places without a clear logic, the system becomes politically expensive to operate. People spend more time negotiating movement than they do creating it, and then something entirely predictable happens. Shadow behavior appears as teams build around the official process. Someone exports data manually, or a manager uses private chats to get a fast sign-off. An analyst might keep a side spreadsheet because the formal dashboard is visible but not actionable. This is not usually an act of rebellion, but rather a form of structural compensation. The official system is often too slow, too unclear, or too disconnected from the actual responsibility carried by the people closest to the work, so they root around it. Leaders often respond the wrong way by seeing sprawl and tightening everything or locking the platform down when they see local tools. They see inconsistency and try to centralize more approvals, but if the root problem is power misalignment, more restriction does not create control. It creates pressure, and that pressure will always find a workaround. That's why redundancy matters here too. If one leader, one inbox, or one approval board becomes the only path through which meaningful action can happen, you have created a single point of failure. It might be a very senior or intelligent point of failure, but it is still a failure point. From a system perspective, concentration is risk. The answer is not decentralization for its own sake, because we are not talking about creating chaos. We are talking about controlled distribution through clear guardrails, ownership, and thresholds. You need enough local authority for the people carrying accountability to actually move the work. This means if a team owns a workflow outcome, they should also have the minimum viable access to improve that workflow safely. If a manager is held accountable for adoption, they need visibility into usage, permission posture, and process friction. If a platform owner is expected to govern safely, they must have intervention rights that are real rather than symbolic. Power alignment is really about removing contradiction from the operating model. Don't tell people they own what they cannot influence, and don't give people access without accountability. You should never deploy AI into workflows where no one can clearly say who decides, who validates, and who corrects. If you do, The system will still produce outcomes, but they will be fragile. The work will be slow in some places, chaotic in others, over-controlled at the top, and under-supported at the edge. That's when leaders start mistaking symptoms for causes. They think the issue is adoption, discipline, or resistance, but often the reason is much simpler. The power model and the work model do not match. Once you see that, the next step gets very practical. Now map that into the enterprise scenarios where this breaks most visibly. Enterprise Scenario 1. Copilot rollout under control logic. Let's make this real with a scenario a lot of Microsoft 365 leaders will recognize immediately. A Copilot rollout begins with energy as licenses are purchased, use cases are collected, and town halls happen. Leaders say the organization needs to move fast, but then the old operating model quietly takes over. Every meaningful use case needs approval, every prompt pattern gets reviewed by central teams, and managers ask for permission before teams even experiment. Business units are told to adopt the tool, but nobody is fully sure where the acceptable boundary actually sits. Access becomes broad on paper while trust stays narrow in practice, and that combination is usually fatal. Broad access without decision clarity does not create adoption, it creates hesitation. People open Copilot and try a few low-risk tasks like summaries, draft emails, or meeting notes, but they do not embed it into the workflows where real value lives. The moment the output starts touching customer communication or internal decisions, the organization falls back into control logic. People feel they must check with legal, IT, compliance, the manager, and the steering group all at once. Now, Copilot is not part of the operating model, but rather a sidecar or a convenience layer. It is useful, but it remains structurally disconnected from how work actually moves. This is where a lot of leaders misread the problem. They look at usage reports and assume adoption is low because people need more training. While that might be true sometimes, the deeper issue is often that the organization has not made the workflow decision ready. The people inside the system do not know where Copilot is trusted, what outputs are acceptable, or when human validation is required. They don't know who owns the final judgment or what business outcome this tool is actually supposed to improve. The rollout becomes a technology deployment without an operating model redesign, which is why licenses can be high while embedded value stays low. The tool exists, but the workflow does not change. And once that happens, reporting takes over. Leadership asks for dashboards on active users and prompt counts, but those numbers can be misleading. A team can use Copilot every day and still produce almost no structural business value if the output never changes a real decision. Activity gets measured because outcome design was skipped. A leader wants safe adoption, so they centralize guidance, which sounds reasonable until local experimentation slows down. If every department must wait for centrally approved scenarios, learning and value both slow to a crawl. The organization then concludes that Copilot is interesting but immature, when often the tool is not the immature part, the leadership design is. Copilot scales where context is explicit and permissions are understood. It works where trusted data is visible and where a team knows which decisions they can support with AI versus which require escalation. You need to define target workflows first by clarifying where Copilot supports summarization or recommendation. State the validation pattern and name the owner of the decision before the rollout begins. When you make the trusted data boundary visible and set thresholds for escalation, people finally know how to use the tool inside their actual business reality. That is when confidence rises and local initiative increases. Copilot stops being an expensive assistant sitting beside the workflow and starts becoming part of the workflow itself. In the end, a rollout fails when leadership treats it like software distribution instead of a decision system redesign. Enterprise Scenario 2. Power Platform Sprawl and the Wrong Response. Now let's look at a second scenario because this one shows the same leadership failure from a different angle. We often see the power platform start spreading through an organization, and usually this happens for a very good reason. The official systems are simply too slow to keep up with the business. So a team builds a quick app to solve a problem right now. Someone automates a manual approval that's been sitting in an inbox, or a department creates a workflow to finally reduce the email chaos. For a while, this feels like progress because it actually is progress. Local friction gets removed by the people closest to the work, and the platform proves its value precisely because it lets the edge of the company respond faster than the center. But then scale arrives. You suddenly have more apps, more flows, and more connectors than anyone can track. The logic starts to overlap, the owners are unknown, and leadership starts to get nervous. This nervousness isn't irrational because the estate can look incredibly messy from the outside. Security questions appear alongside concerns about support and data quality, making the entire environment harder to see or manage. This is usually when the control reflex kicks in. Leadership decides to lock it down, freeze new builds, and restrict environments until every request can be routed through a central review. In most cases, this is the wrong response. It's not that governance is wrong, but panic centralization treats the symptom while killing the learning loop that revealed the demand in the first place. That is the part most leaders miss. Power platform sprawl is rarely just a governance problem. It is a signal. It shows you exactly where your official operating model is too slow, too rigid, or too disconnected from business reality. People do not build shadow workflows because they enjoy complexity. They build them because the formal path cannot absorb the speed, nuance, or volume of their local needs. When leadership responds by shutting the whole thing down, the organization does not become healthier, it just becomes quieter. The demand doesn't disappear, it just goes underground. That is structural compensation. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. It's just not designed for what the business actually needs. Now map that to leadership. A control-oriented leader sees sprawl and concludes the problem is too much autonomy, but a design-oriented leader sees that same sprawl and asks a better question. They want to know what unmet need this growth is pointing to and where the official platform model is failing to serve the work. They look for where people are solving real friction without a safe, visible path to do it well. That shift in perspective changes the intervention completely. The answer is not a blanket restriction, but rather a system of tiered autonomy. You need guardrails, shared patterns, and visible ownership. You need a structure that says certain automations can be built locally inside clear limits, while others require review because the risk profile is higher. This is governance as enablement, not governance as fear. Why is this so important in the Microsoft ecosystem? Because the Power Platform is designed to amplify initiative. It lets business teams translate friction into action. But if governance only shows up as a blocking function, leadership teaches the organization a dangerous lesson. They teach people not to solve problems visibly, but to hide them until they are undeniable. That is how trust collapses between the center and the edge. Once that trust breaks, every future platform conversation gets harder. Business teams hear the word governance and think delay, while central teams hear innovation and think risk. Everyone becomes defensive, and the platform loses its strategic role. This is where power alignment matters. If local teams are expected to improve workflows, they need safe building lanes to do it. If central teams are expected to govern, they need visibility and standards that don't depend on discovering problems when it's already too late. Platform owners who want to scale value need a model that distributes capability without distributing chaos. That means moving from uncontrolled creation to designed participation. You build a community model with reusable components and clear environment strategies. The payoff for this approach is much bigger than simple control. You keep local initiative alive and surface real business demand while reducing shadow IT by making the sanctioned path actually usable. Every app and every workaround is telling you something about the business reality your core systems are not handling well enough. Power alignment beats blanket restriction every time. If leaders miss that, they will spend their time suppressing symptoms instead of redesigning the system around the demand. Enterprise scenario 3, decision bottlenecks in hybrid AI teams. Then there is the most common executive failure of all. The team gets faster, but the approvals don't. Hybrid AI teams can now generate options, summaries, and implementation plans far faster than most management structures were built to absorb. The visible output goes up, and the number of possible next actions increases, but the coordination model often stays exactly where it was before. That mismatch creates a new kind of bottleneck. It's not that the team is slow, but that the organization cannot metabolize the speed of the team. Leaders often misdiagnose this by saying the team is moving too fast or that AI is flooding the office with noise. While that might be partly true, the deeper issue is orchestration. The system has increased generation capacity without redesigning decision capacity. This matters a lot in hybrid work because the old informal correction paths are weaker. People are not always in the same room to catch nuance through hallway conversations or resolve ambiguity through quick visual cues. When AI accelerates output in distributed environments, what used to feel manageable through informal coordination starts breaking apart. You see more recommendations and proposed actions, but less shared clarity about what actually moves next. This creates the visibility paradox. The organization can see more than ever, but it feels less coordinated than before. Speed without orchestration creates fragmentation. One team might be on version 3 of a response, while another is still waiting for sign-off. A manager might have a smart summary from Copilot but no clear authority to act on it. The issue is not pace. The issue is that increased decision volume is still flowing through old approval architecture. In a hybrid AI team, if every meaningful action still needs to move upward for reassurance, then AI doesn't reduce friction. It just raises the volume of decisions waiting in line. The queue gets smarter, but it does not get shorter. Leaders start feeling overwhelmed because the structure around capability has not evolved. This is why lightweight decision frameworks matter so much more than heavy approval chains. A heavy chain assumes uncertainty should be solved by upward review, but a lightweight framework assumes uncertainty should be sorted by category. You have to define what can be decided locally and what truly needs escalation. That kind of design performs much better under AI acceleration because it keeps movement close to the work. Calmer organizations start separating themselves from stressed ones by making movement legible. People know what lane they are in, they know which threshold changes that lane, and they know who owns the call. This creates speed without chaos and calm without stagnation. The best AI-enabled organizations are not frantic, they are decisive. Frantic organizations confuse activity with adaptation, But decisive organizations reduce ambiguity at the point where action needs to happen. When I look at hybrid AI teams, I don't ask if they have enough tools. I ask if their decision pathways were redesigned for a world where option generation is abundant and coordination is distributed. If that redesign does not happen, the whole organization starts blaming the wrong thing. They blame AI for the pressure, but that pressure is a system outcome. AI increased the pace of possible action, but the leadership model failed to increase the pace of authorized action. That is the bottleneck. Organizations that solve it gain something bigger than speed. They become easier to work inside. You end up with fewer unnecessary escalations, less hidden waiting, and more confidence at the edge. There is more energy for real judgment instead of managerial choreography. That is where the future advantage sits. It's not in producing more options, but in deciding well among them without routing every important moment through a structure built for a slower world. After all these scenarios, the real question becomes obvious. What capabilities does a leader actually need if control is no longer the thing that scales it up? Capability 1. System thinking. So what is the actual capability that sits underneath all of this? It is system thinking. I'm not talking about a nice-to-have skill or something we should leave to the architects, operations specialists, or transformation teams. This is a fundamental leadership requirement for the world we live in now. Because if traditional control is failing while AI increases our speed and decision volume, leaders need a way to see far beyond individual events. They need to see the flow. They need to understand dependencies, incentives, and bottlenecks. Instead of reading recurring friction as an isolated human weakness, leaders must start seeing it as a structural pattern. That is exactly what system thinking does for an organization. It changes your entire unit of analysis. Rather than asking who dropped the ball, you start asking where the work consistently slows down. Instead of wondering why people are resisting change, you ask what in the environment makes caution the only rational behavior for them. When a team isn't taking ownership, you stop blaming their motivation and ask what part of the design separates their responsibility from their actual authority. This is a very different way of seeing the world, and it has never been more important than it is today. The reason is that AI makes local symptoms appear much faster than they used to. A delay that once stayed invisible for weeks now becomes obvious in days, and a bad approval structure that once felt manageable will collapse under a higher volume of decisions. A weak handoff that used to stay hidden inside endless emails and meetings is now exposed the moment teams generate and process options faster than ever before. If a leader cannot read systems, they will spend their entire career reacting to symptoms. They will throw more training at a problem, add more governance, or schedule a new meeting and a new dashboard. While those things might help a little bit, they are often just structural compensation layered on top of structural confusion. The real question is always deeper than the surface level. You have to ask where the work is waiting, where the context is breaking, and where the approvals are clustering. You need to identify where a single person, team, or queue is becoming a single point of failure for the entire operation. That is the lens you need to adopt. This is why system thinking is now business critical rather than just being technically interesting. Strategy does not fail only at the strategy layer, it fails in the operating flow. A company can have a clear AI ambition, a massive budget, and executive sponsorship, but they will still see disappointing results if the movement of work remains badly designed. That is not a technology problem, it is a systems problem. This really clicked for me while I was working on large technology programs where leaders kept trying to solve delays with pure pressure. They would tell people to push harder, review more often, or escalate sooner. But when we actually mapped the flow, the same patterns kept showing up regardless of how hard people worked. Decisions waited in the same places, clarification was needed in the same spots, and ownership blurred in the same areas every single time. The issue was never about effort, because the issue was actually the architecture of the system itself. Once you see that, your approach to leadership changes completely. You stop trying to be the person who has all the answers. Instead, you start becoming the person who can see the shape of the problem clearly enough to redesign it. That means looking across boundaries rather than just focusing on your specific function or your reporting line. You have to look at the interaction between tools, teams, permissions, habits, and incentives. Most business friction lives in the seams between departments. You see marketing waiting on legal, operations waiting on data, or project teams waiting on a sponsor to give them reassurance. Business units wait on IT, and managers wait on leaders who are themselves waiting on another committee to make a move. That is how organizations burn through time without even noticing it. System thinking lets you trace that hidden cost so you can actually do something about it. It also protects you from one of the biggest mistakes of the AI era, which is over-personalizing structural outcomes. When a team looks slow or a manager looks cautious, the easy move is to make it about their mindset. But if the same behavior keeps appearing, across different people in the same environment, the smarter assumption is that the environment is teaching that behavior. It is a system outcome. Once leaders internalize this truth, they become much more precise in how they work. They intervene with design rather than just applying more pressure. They change thresholds, clarify rights, and remove unnecessary handoffs that don't add value. They focus on creating better feedback loops and reducing concentration risk. This is what makes system thinking so powerful for a modern business. It helps you see that performance is rarely just about talent or motivation. It is actually about the conditions under which that talent and motivation are asked to operate. In the AI era, those conditions are changing faster than we can keep up with. This is the first capability that separates old school leadership from what comes next. Can you see the organization as a living decision system? Can you spot the hidden dependencies before they turn into a total failure? Can you read recurring friction as valuable design data? Once you can do those things, the next capability becomes possible. You can start designing the decision layer itself. Capability 2, decision design. Once you can see the system, the next leadership capability you need is decision design. This is where systems thinking turns into an operating reality for the business. Seeing a bottleneck is useful, but redesigning how decisions actually happen is what changes your performance. This is the part that many leaders still skip over. They understand that too much work is moving upward and that teams are waiting too long for answers. They see that AI is producing more options than the organization can possibly absorb, but then they respond with encouragement instead of architecture. They tell people to be more proactive, use better judgment, or escalate less often. While that sounds reasonable on the surface, it is an incomplete solution. If you want better decisions at scale, you have to design the categories, thresholds, and review paths that make good judgment repeatable. Let me make this practical for you. A useful decision model starts by defining specific decision classes. Not every decision deserves the same treatment, which means some should stay local while others are shared or escalated. Some can even be automated entirely. Some decisions should only trigger human attention when something unusual happens. That classification matters because without it, everything starts to feel equally risky to the people doing the work. When everything feels risky, escalation becomes the default behavior for everyone involved. That is exactly how leadership overload gets recreated, even in organizations that claim they want more autonomy. A leader needs to ask a small set of design questions to fix this. Which decisions belong closest to the work and which ones need cross-functional input before anyone takes action? You have to decide which ones genuinely require senior escalation because the trade-offs affect the entire enterprise. You also need to know which ones are repetitive enough to automate inside a safe boundary and which ones should run normally until an exception occurs. That is what decision design looks like in practice. It is not an abstract concept, it is a purely operational one. Once those classes exist, the next layer of inputs becomes just as important. You have to define what data is required before someone acts and what level of confidence is actually enough to move forward. You need to know what counts as sufficient evidence and what specifically triggers a second review or an escalation. If these things stay unwritten, people will fill the gap with office politics. One manager will move fast while another waits for total certainty. One team might treat AI as a strong first pass while another treats it as a draft that still needs a full manual recreation from scratch. The result of this is inconsistency, and it doesn't happen because people are careless. It happens because the decision environment is vague. This is why I always say that predictability matters more than raw intelligence. A highly intelligent organization with poorly defined decision pathways will still behave erratically. On the other hand, a moderately intelligent organization with strong decision design often performs better because people actually know how to move. Now, map that logic to your governance. A lot of leaders hear the term decision design and assume it means they have to give up control. Actually, it is the opposite. It is how you keep the quality of control without forcing a concentration of control at the top. You are not removing oversight. You are moving it upstream into the design of the pathway itself. You define where human review is required and where automation is allowed. You define where local action is safe and what happens when the pattern finally breaks. That creates consistency without needing executive hands in every single moment. This is where the concept of escalation has to change as well. Escalation should be the exception to the rule, not the standard operating model for the company. If every unclear moment gets pushed upward, the organization eventually trains itself to avoid using judgment at all. But if escalation is tied to explicit thresholds, people start learning where their decision lane really begins and ends. That builds the kind of confidence that turns distributed capability into real performance. Without that confidence, teams have access to tools but no real agency to use them. AI might be present in the workflow, but it won't be trusted. Leaders will stay overloaded because the system keeps routing every bit of uncertainty back to their desks. If you want one shortcut for this, here it is. Design the path before you demand better decisions from your people. Define the classes, the thresholds, the review logic, and the exception flow. Most importantly, define who owns the correction when the pattern fails. That last part matters a lot because a decision system without correction ownership becomes brittle very quickly. People will act until something goes wrong and then everyone suddenly rediscovers the old hierarchy. That isn't resilience, it is just borrowed speed that won't last. Real decision design includes feedback on the back end. You need to know who notices drift and who is responsible for updating the rules or changing the thresholds. Someone has to be in charge of retiring the automation if it stops serving the business reality it was meant to support. That is the real leadership move. You are moving from heroic decision-making to a repeatable decision architecture. Once leaders start doing that well, the organization becomes noticeably lighter for everyone involved. There is less waiting, less ambiguity, and much less executive drag on the system. You get more local judgment, backed by stronger guardrails. That is what scales in the AI era. It isn't about smarter leaders making more calls. It is about better leaders designing how those calls get made. Capability 3, power alignment. Decision design falls apart if power remains unevenly distributed. This is the next capability leaders have to build, and to be honest, it is exactly where most AI initiatives quietly fail. You can invest in better tools, more advanced models, and optimized workflows, but you will still get weak outcomes if the people expected to act lack the authority or support to carry their responsibility. That is what I call power misalignment, and once you know what to look for, you see it everywhere. A team is told to improve the customer experience, yet they aren't allowed to change the underlying workflow that causes the friction. A manager is held accountable for AI adoption, but they can't see the actual usage signals clearly enough to know when to intervene. We see business units expected to use AI responsibly, while the rules for data and escalation are scattered across 4 different departments. The burden of the outcome sits in one place, but the ability to influence that outcome sits somewhere else. From a system perspective, that isn't just a management headache, it is a structural fragility that puts the whole operation at risk. Accountability without authority creates hesitation, while authority without accountability creates drift, and neither leads to the performance you need. Power alignment is the leadership work of matching 4 specific things: authority, access, accountability, and support. If any one of those pieces is missing, the system will try to compensate in ways that look like bad behavior. People will escalate every tiny detail just to stay safe, or they'll start rotating around formal processes to get things done. They create side channels and wait for unofficial blessings before moving, which makes leadership look at the team and call them resistant or immature. Usually, the reality is much simpler than a lack of maturity. The structure is asking people to perform ownership without actually equipping them for it, and this gap becomes a massive problem in AI-enabled environments. AI increases reach by giving more people the ability to analyze, draft, and automate, which sounds empowering on paper. But if the authority model stays vague, you get a dangerous mix of widened capability and concentrated permission. People can see more and suggest more, but they still can't decide more, and that gap creates frustration faster than almost anything else. This is why so many AI outputs end up influencing absolutely nothing. The recommendation is there, the insight is accurate, and the summary is good, but the person receiving it doesn't own the decision. The output just hangs in the system like optional advice, interesting and visible, but ultimately non-binding. When that becomes the pattern, adoption feels inconsistent because structurally it is inconsistent. I believe leaders need to become much more explicit about where power is concentrated. You have to ask who can act, who can stop action, and who has the right to intervene when the risk profile changes. If too many of those rights sit in one person or one approval queue, you've created a single point of failure. The issue here isn't a lack of competence, it's a problem of structural dependence. Many organizations are still compensating for fragile power models through informal behavior like private chats and manual data exports. People build these shadow routes because they need movement, and the formal system can no longer carry the speed of the work. That is structural compensation in action. The goal isn't blind decentralization or giving everyone equal power and hoping for the best. It is about controlled distribution and clear decision rights that match local authority to local accountability. You need enough oversight to catch drift without suffocating the flow of the work. If you remember nothing else, remember that people cannot sustainably own outcomes they are not structurally allowed to influence. Once leaders understand this, they stop asking who is responsible and start asking if responsibility and power are actually aligned in the same place. That alignment is what makes AI useful at scale. It isn't just about broader access or smarter outputs, but a model where the people closest to the work can act inside clear guardrails without waiting for hierarchy to bless every move. To keep that structure healthy, leaders need one more capability: feedback loops. Capability 4, feedback loops. Feedback loops are the 4th capability because even the best designed systems eventually drift. A decision pathway that worked 6 months ago might not fit the business today, and guardrails that felt clear at rollout often become ambiguous under pressure. AI outputs that were useful in one context get overused in another as priorities and risks change. The environment is always moving, and if you don't build a way to sense that movement, the organization becomes brittle without anyone noticing. In the AI era, scale creates distance. which means there are more teams, more automations, and more delegated decisions than ever before. This creates more places where things can quietly go wrong while looking perfectly fine on the surface. Without a functional feedback loop, leaders only discover failure after the damage has become expensive and visible. You see it in customer escalations, compliance issues, or a burned-out manager who has been struggling in silence. By the time a platform locks up or a workflow loses the trust of the team, it's already too late. A real feedback loop is designed to catch that strain much earlier by telling you where the design is no longer producing the intended outcome. To make this work, you have to keep it small and avoid the trap of building giant review rituals full of slides that nobody actually uses. The point of a feedback loop isn't to generate more reporting, but to create a short learning cycle around the health of the system. I suggest anchoring your feedback around a few specific signals: decision speed, ownership clarity, override frequency, rework, and trust. If decision speed drops or ownership clarity fades, it's a sign that people are losing confidence in where action belongs. When you see overrides rise sharply, it usually means the AI output is weakening or the review logic has become too vague for the current context. If rework increases, the system is likely compensating for ambiguity somewhere upstream. And if trust drops, performance will almost always follow it down. Leaders need recurring reviews that ask design questions rather than personality questions to get to the root of these issues. Instead of hunting for someone to blame, you should be reading signals from the operating model to see where decisions are slowing down. Blame creates silence and causes people to hide problems until they become political, but feedback creates a culture of learning. If anomalies are treated as design data, the organization becomes much more honest and you can solve problems while they are still small. This is exactly why mature engineering environments tend to outperform traditional management cultures. In engineering, a recurring failure is a signal to inspect the architecture, whereas many managers still treat failure as evidence that someone needs to try harder. Trying harder doesn't scale, it just exhausts the people inside the system until they eventually quit or check out. Leaders need to normalize a posture where they inspect the design when a problem repeats and inspect the context when trust drops. That is the loop: signal, interpretation, adjustment, and retest. The adjustment doesn't have to be a massive transformation. Sometimes it's just a threshold change or removing one unnecessary approval that has been distorting behavior for months. Small design changes made consistently create a far more adaptive organization than occasional transformation theater. This is also where the ROI of AI becomes realistic, because value doesn't come from a one-time tool launch. It comes from continuously tuning the workflow around where AI helps and where human judgment matters most. Feedback loops turn AI from a project into an operating discipline and move leadership from episodic intervention to continuous calibration. Most importantly, they protect your structural resilience by stopping bad pathways from becoming standard practice. Leaders who embrace this stop trying to grip the system harder and instead start helping the system learn how to succeed. 7-day leadership reset. Let me make this practical for you. This is the exact point where many leaders agree with everything conceptually, but then they change absolutely nothing operationally. They will tell me that control is slowing them down and that AI is changing the flow of decisions, yet they never actually adjust their behavior. Monday morning rolls around, the calendar fills up with the same old meetings, and the traditional model quietly resumes its hold on the organization. That is why I believe you need a 7-day reset rather than a massive transformation program. You don't need a 6-month operating model, redesign deck, or a series of expensive workshops to see a real difference. What you need is 1 week, 1 decision loop, and 1 visible change to prove the system can work differently. Start by picking 1 recurring decision that still waits on leadership much longer than it should. Don't go for the biggest strategic move in the company or the most politically sensitive topic you can find. Instead, choose a decision that happens often enough to actually teach you something about how your system functions. You might look at customer exception approvals, internal policy interpretations, or even simple content sign-offs that currently get stuck in your inbox. Pick something real that currently slows down because your people still believe leadership needs to touch it before the work can move forward. Once you have that decision in mind, map out the actual flow of how it happens today. I am talking about the real-world path it takes, not the idealized version written in your process documents. You need to see who starts the request, who adds their input, and who ultimately makes the final call. Look closely at what data gets used and which tools support the process, but pay special attention to where the work sits waiting. You want to find where it bounces back for clarification and where the whole thing quietly depends on one person saying yes before anyone feels safe moving. That map matters because most decision friction hides in unstated assumptions rather than formal rules. And people often think they know where the bottleneck is, but usually they only know where the frustration finally becomes visible. They rarely see where the structural drag actually begins. So once you see the real flow, your job is to remove exactly 1 unnecessary approval. Just 1 change is enough to start the process without breaking the system. If you try to remove too much at once, people will get nervous and the system will start reading the change as a sign of instability. But if you remove 1 approval approval that exists out of habit rather than true risk, the positive effect becomes visible almost immediately. After you cut that approval, you must define one explicit decision owner for that specific loop. It cannot be a committee, it cannot be the leadership team, and it definitely cannot be a vague partnership between business and IT. You need one owner who knows they have the authority to make the call inside agreed boundaries and who understands exactly when an escalation is actually required. Now you have to check the obvious question that most organizations skip entirely. Does that new owner actually have the data, the context, and the system access they need to decide well? If the answer is no, then you haven't actually redesigned the system at all. You have just redistributed the pressure onto someone else. Ownership without access isn't empowerment. It is just structural theater that sets people up for failure. So you have to fix the access issues too, and then you need to set one single metric to track your progress. For most of the teams I work with, I suggest choosing either decision latency or a reduction in rework. You want to know how long the decision takes from the moment an issue is detected until action is taken. You also want to see how often a decision comes back because the boundary or the quality threshold was unclear. This gives you a clean before and after signal that proves whether your design is actually working. 1 week later, you need to review what changed, but don't do this with a giant steering committee. Sit down with the people who are actually inside the flow and ask them if the decision felt faster or if the quality held up. Find out if they felt clearer about who owned the outcome or if new types of confusion started to appear. You should also ask if the AI support became more useful or if the new speed exposed a different gap in your tools. Most importantly, find out if anyone still behaved as if they needed unofficial permission from above to move forward. That last question matters more than most leaders realize because the social memory of control often outlasts the formal design. People will still escalate problems because the old system trained them to do so for years. That isn't a sign of failure, but rather a form of feedback that tells you where your behavior still needs to reinforce the new design. If you want a deeper challenge, don't just review the workflow, you have to review yourself. Ask yourself if you stepped back when the new owner could have acted, or if you waited for the metric instead of jumping in at the first sign of discomfort. You have to know if you reinforced the boundary or if you quietly overrode it because staying central still feels safer for your ego. This is the real replacement for control, and it isn't about caring less, but rather about building a better architecture. If you do this well, you will learn that most organizations don't need more leadership attention in every workflow. They actually need fewer points where leadership attention is structurally required to keep things moving. That is the reset. Pick one loop, map it honestly, remove one approval, and name one owner. Check their access, measure one signal, and review the results 1 week later. If you audited one decision loop this way every week for the next quarter, you would know more about your leadership model than any strategy offsite could ever tell you. Business payoff and future positioning. So what is the actual business payoff when leadership finally moves from a mindset of control to one of design? First, your decision speed improves without the organization becoming reckless or losing its way. That matters more than most dashboards show because the cost of delay is a silent killer in the modern enterprise. In most companies, the cost of waiting isn't dramatic enough to trigger a crisis, but it is constant enough to drain performance every single day. Work waits in queues, priorities become blurred, and teams spend more time preparing for decisions than they do actually making them. AI might generate a great insight, but the value arrives too late to matter if the approval process is broken. When you redesign the decision pathway, that structural drag starts to leave the system entirely. The gain isn't just about raw speed, but rather a cleaner form of speed with less circular review and less duplicated interpretation. You end up with far less executive involvement in moments that never truly required executive judgment in the first place. The second payoff is a much lower dependency on leadership acting as invisible infrastructure. This is one of the most important changes a company can make. Yet it is rarely discussed in boardrooms. In many organizations, leaders are still holding the entire system together through sheer personal intervention and manual effort. They know exactly who to call to unblock a stuck approval, and they know how to resolve ambiguity informally to keep a project alive. Because they are so good at this, the organization starts mistaking that rescue pattern for strong leadership. But from a system perspective, that is an incredibly fragile way to run a business. It means your performance depends on constant structural compensation from a very small number of people. When leadership becomes architectural, that unhealthy dependence starts to fall away, so the organization can move without constant executive rescue. That isn't a loss of leadership, it is a sign of leadership maturity. The third payoff you will see is much higher AI adoption where it actually counts for the bottom line. I'm not talking about cosmetic usage or a burst of experiments that never change your core workflows. Real adoption only happens when teams know where the AI fits, what boundaries apply, and who owns the final call. That is the moment when Copilot becomes a standard part of preparation and follow-through for every employee. Automation becomes a core part of your service delivery and internal operations because the decision routing is finally clear. This is when AI stops being a side tool and becomes genuine operating leverage for the business. And that leads directly to the fourth payoff, which is a much better return on your technology investment. The reason is simple. AI creates business value when it changes a decision or reduces the effort inside a specific workflow. If none of those things change, then your costs and activity might go up, but your actual value stays vague. This is exactly why so many organizations struggle to show a return on their AI spend today. They bought the intelligence, but they didn't bother to redesign the execution model that uses it. Once you start redesigning the operating model around decision flow and power alignment, the economics of the business get much clearer. You will see less latency, less rework, and a significant reduction in your concentration risk. You get more throughput and more consistency, which creates more usable capacity from the same group of people you already have. That is the business reality of a well-designed system. There is also a longer-term advantage here regarding your structural resilience. The companies that will perform best in the AI era are not the ones with the most press releases or the most expensive tools. They are the ones that can absorb speed without becoming chaotic and distribute judgment without losing accountability. They are the organizations that can keep learning without creating new single points of failure every single quarter. That is the future positioning question you have to answer for yourself. Are you building an organization that only gets faster when your best leaders are personally involved in the details? Or are you building one that gets stronger because the design itself helps your people move well on their own? That difference becomes a strategic advantage very quickly, especially in environments where Microsoft tools are making it easier to generate insight at the edge. If your leadership model stays trapped in the logic of control, those new tools will only amplify the friction you already feel. But if your leadership model evolves into system design, those same tools will amplify your clarity, your speed, and your ability to scale. When people ask me what leadership becomes in the AI era, my answer is always very direct. It becomes less about controlling the work and more about shaping the conditions under which good work can happen repeatedly. You need less managerial presence and more structural precision. You need fewer heroics and more resilience built into the fabric of the company. From a business point of view, that is the real upgrade you are looking for. It isn't a battle of leader versus AI, but rather the leader acting as the architect of how intelligence becomes performance. I want you to remember that in this AI era, leadership is no longer about staying in every decision, because that creates a single point of failure for your entire organization. It has become the discipline of designing those decisions so the system can move without you, which is why we have to treat leadership as architecture rather than just management. If this perspective helped you today, please leave a review and connect with me on LinkedIn to tell me where control is still slowing your organization down. I also want to hear which Microsoft 365, Copilot, or Azure topics you want me to unpack next, because your system outcomes depend on the infrastructure we build today. If you audited your leadership the same way you audit your systems, would you find a structure designed to scale or a bottleneck waiting to happen?